So,
Okay.
okay.
All right. So to start off with, would you like to say your name and where you are?
My name is Chris Campbell, or Christopher Campbell, and I live in Australia, but am originally from Los Angeles.
And the first big question is, who are you? Who are you as a person, as a human being? And that can be values or passions or qualities or whatever you'd like to share.
An enormous question. Well, I guess, well, for one thing, I'm very, very passionate about the work that I do, which I made a choice to be a psychotherapist rather than a psychologist / I have a PhD in psychology. But yeah, I have probably my greatest passion is working with people and supporting people in general, I'd say therapeutically, but interested in, especially when I go to other cultures, but supporting other cultures who may not be into therapy, but supporting them in creating situations where they interact and engage and are more vulnerable with each other. Um, and other than emergency at this period of time in Australia, meaning COVID kind of situation and healthcare things, but um, the whole situation has changed greatly in terms of just the type of therapy um, that pretty much I have access to, which was mainly people that just plain wanted to know about themselves. So I'm kind of indulging who I am relative to the passion of therapy right now, but that is a major part of who I am. Um, um, yeah, I'll stick with that for a few minutes anyway. So I I would say I love working or being with people who want to know more about themselves. Um, and I've devoted a good part of my life to that. Um, and I would say, in terms of, say, even early days, kind of mid 60s, I would say, in terms of experiences with LSD and so forth, I was very interested in expanding awareness of um, who I had thought I was. So I suppose from that time, fairly conventional kind of growing up in the 50s, early 60s in Los Angeles, fairly kind of conventional um, modern tract house with young families all around. And then I think kind of mid 60s, then starting to question the reality of the sort of Leave It to Beaver type of life, Ozzie and Harriet kind of things. And so from that, I think even early days, say with the LSD, that I would be kind of at the center of being with other people as they were maybe having their first experiences and things. So um, I have a deep passion about being with people and working with people, but mm, in general, I'd say people who want to know more about themselves. And even to the extent that I kind of seclude myself from general society, so to speak, where um, I think a underlying principle that I have is that we're all neurotic, and I don't like to be overly exposed to neurosis rather than people that prefer to know about their neurosis. So, yeah, I'd say people and family, another part of that. But they're at the
Would you
heart.
say that there are particular values that you hold in this? I mean, I'm hearing valuing self-knowledge and facilitating that, but what would you say your sort of core values are?
Well, I think maybe linking up that question that you said with where I just was, but I think that just kind of putting a marker, but I'm very interested in developmental psychology. So, in terms of the spirit and who we have come into the world as a free spirit, and then how that has been shaped from the outside, pretty much without our choice or permission, so on and so on. But so I would say at my core, it's to um, live the life that I was given coming into this world, which means a very interesting journey of reclaiming, say, the spirit that I came into that world with, um, which I think is a never ending, ongoing process. But so I would say I have a spiritual core value, but that is quite different than most people's spiritual pursuits, where mine is how fascinating, sometimes quite painful, but how much I am in pursuit of, say, reclaiming the core that I came into, quote unquote, the God-given core that I came into this world with. Um, so yeah, that's probably at the heart of much of who I am, and then just going backwards, also wanting to encourage and support and engage with people in that type of process as well. Um, I am very, very, very interested in other cultures. Um, the biggest gift of being in Australia for the last 38 years, roughly 40, um, has been the exposure to Asia, and so I really love seeing how other cultures live and interpret things, and what's important to them, and how they are socially, how they were raised. And so I've spent a lot of time in Asia, mainly Japan and Burma, um, and Indonesia mostly. And yeah, so that's really, really at the core of my life, is the exploration of finding out about other people other than the kind of Western bubble that I grew up in. Um, ongoing process of learning about love, and allowing allowing to be loved, ongoing process of that. Um, yeah, so that's what I'll probably think of other things afterward. Or why didn't I say that relative to my
Well,
core
I mean that
values?
that question sort of keeps getting answered through the rest of the conversation, but
Okay.
yeah. So when you talk about love, I don't know if it's necessarily any kind of love in particular, but I'm curious, in your contact with other people, um, who would you say has had a significant impact on you, has influenced you or shaped you in some significant way?
Um, so we're speaking relative to love in particular, or just
Oh, no,
in
I just
general?
sort of thought, well, I wonder if it's through love or through contact, but I mean, any kind of contact, I suppose. But basically, I'm curious about other people or another person in particular who has really had an impact on you.
Well, I feel goosebumps as you ask that because it's really a bit out of the sphere of, say, loving relationship, quote unquote. But I did try and ring her a couple of days ago and have had very not too much contact with her over the years. But um, when I went from a time of, say, exploration of drugs to over experimentation, say, with drugs, um, and I found myself a single parent to a very young child at that time, and felt that it was really time um, to get my life in order, so to speak, and to pursue what I was really passionate about, which I didn't know yet then. But that process was me being in therapy, and in particular, um, Reichian therapy with a man named Richard Turner. Um, and from that experience, um, I learned so much about myself in a different way than, say, the LSD and so forth. I learned so much about myself, and so I immediately felt like, well, I want to share this with other people, this kind of experience. And then my image was kind of a tool bag. And so I started doing yoga, and then I started to um, study other related things that I thought, well, I'll have a tool bag, and I'd love to help people the way that I was helped. So at that particular point of time, and I feel almost teary about it, but the woman that I mentioned that I tried to call a couple of times, but her name was Linda Sussman, is Linda Sussman. And Linda Sussman lives in Oregon and is a Jungian therapist and several other related things. But Linda, just meeting her at the right place and time, at a time when I was inquiring about courses to develop myself and things to put in my tool bag to help other people. And I think I was 24, maybe, I guess. And Linda Sussman was Harold Stone voice dialogue. She was his personal assistant, offsider. Um, Harold was quite busy with his practice, and um, Linda did much of the practical kind of work. But Linda took an enormous liking to me, and I think my situation of single parenting and so forth. and and Hal Stone trusted her enormously. And at that point, I didn't really know Hal, but essentially, Linda Sussman basically said, "Look, um, I want to open the doors of this place, the Center of the Healing Arts, to you, because you have this passion." Again, I feel teary. Because you have this passion um, about learning about yourself and about helping and working with other people. And she said, there is so much that's going on here at the Center for the Healing Arts. And one of the kind of umbrellas of that was something called the Cancer Research Project that had to do with a couple, the Symingtons, who were relative to, superficially for the moment, but meditation and cancer and so forth. But Hal had created with that like a whole community of therapists, and really, really, really the most brilliant therapists, in Southern California at that rare moment in time. Um, and the Center for the Healing Arts was the core place where all worked together in various configurations of running courses and being in groups together and having groups for people who had cancer, doing individual work with people who had cancer. And there were nutritionalists and people who were into journal writing. And I wish I had a list of names because they're all very, very well known, quite, amazing people, all in their own ways. And so here I am, roughly mid 20s, and and Linda just, with Hal's permission, throws open the door to this being my oyster, basically. Um, and so I have an enormous love of Linda and how the impact that she has had on my life, again, with Hal's permission and support. And um, Hal is he's no longer alive. He died recently, but he's come and visited me in Australia. And yeah, so I did develop a good relationship with Hal, but Hal, so much going on. So my main focus was with Linda's husband. And she really, really, really changed my life and supported me in a number of years of just me unfolding and becoming, and quite good at what I did. I ended up um, being one of the leaders of the Reichian therapy training program that they had there. And so pretty much, so I'd say, Linda, I have an idea of opening a bookstore at the Center for the Healing Arts. Okay, Chris, so we'll open a bookstore there. And it's, Linda, for 4 years roughly, I want to run an ongoing film series on the weekends that has to do with cultures around the world and to do with spirituality and things like Alan Watts. And so that was very, very well attended. And um, yeah, and lots of biographical kind of videos, films of um, people like Abraham Maslow or Carl Jung. Um, and then at the end of that film series, then um, I would invite different, with absolutely no agenda, but different people, different organizations to come in and offer meditation after the films and teach what their format or form of meditation was. And that was a kind of free addendum to the film series. And so, yeah, so the world was my oyster, and thanks to Linda, and I continued to learn within that environment and step up and be respected and appreciated for what I had learned, and that became an avenue of expression for that. Yeah.
So I'm hearing support and opening doors. That sounds lovely. It's a nice way to impact someone for sure.
It was phenomenal. I mean, I just, I feel like, I mean, I hate kind of terminology like this, but the universe providing the right place and the right time and the right people, and just, it was just so fortunate. And yeah, and such a rare time too to learn from people who had been practicing for many, many years and so much experience. And yeah, under people like a really, really wonderful woman, Naomi Pollock, who at that time was a Gestalt therapist, but also drama, and people like Jack Rosenberg, and um, yeah, it was such a gift to be able to learn whatever I wanted from whoever I wanted, and all these people being, yeah. I think when I was talking to Linda Sussman a few months ago, but she said, "Oh, Chris, Jack Rosenberg is calling me on the other phone, and I think he's now 88 and living in Hawaii." And then I looked up Naomi Pollock before our conversation, and um, I think her program is called the Jewish Traveling Theater Company or something, and then I think she's still alive, and she's I think 91 or something, or so these legends that,
Mhm. An
yeah,
extraordinary time to coincide there.
incredible time, yeah.
Mm. So I am curious. I mean, it sounds very sounds like a bit of a reductive question. But what does come to mind as a particular experience or a set of circumstances in your life which you would say really did change you or your path?
Um, well, I would say that probably those things. I think, well, the three things that I've already mentioned in a way, probably the experiences, say, with LSD, um, and also MDMA, which, just as a side note, but when MDMA was legal here in Australia, I have run groups and done couples therapy and individual therapy with that. But that was kind of jumping a little bit ahead, and then it became illegal and stopped for me. But I would say my experiences of like mind expanding, eye-opening, again coming out of the Ozzie and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver generation, and kind of neighborhood, where who knew what was really happening, but it looked like Leave It to Beaver and Ozzie and Harriet. um, those life-changing experiences, I would say, were the mind-altering drug
Mhm.
experiences, and then just the linking that up with the deep experiences that I had
Mhm.
um, through therapy and self-awareness and helping others. And then probably then the third thing I would say is what I already mentioned, was coming here and having the whole world of Asia opened up to me. And I think those are probably um, alongside with, in a different way, having children and grandchildren. They're
Yeah, that's a trip
life
in
altering
itself.
experiences. Yeah, but event wise, I would say that in terms of lifelong, still learning from family relationships and children and grandchildren. And yeah, I feel
So,
fortunate. I'm, I'm I'd say, quite close with my three children and my grandchildren, and I'm quite proud of all of them and who they are and what they're doing and how they're doing it, and must have done something right somewhere along the line, I
hmm.
suppose. And
So,
my partner.
mhm. I am curious. It's something I've never really asked anybody about. But what would you say stayed with you or has changed your way of being in the world from those particular psychedelic experiences? I mean, I'm not talking about like the technical research, like what have you learned from it, but as a person, what does that give in you?
Well, I think that the level of awareness and information, again, I mean, I keep referring back to the kind of um, archetypal kind of 50s growing up, middle class, suburban Los Angeles. I think that, so, I mean, simplistically, I think my parents were probably quite staunch Republicans or something. So my fantasy is that I would have just been like my parents because that would have been all that I knew from that time. Um, I'll just put a kind of addendum in there that I guess in terms of change in my awareness. Okay, so in primary school, it was exactly like I said, kind of leave it to Beaver. But then when I went to high school, it was quite profound because high school and junior high school, it was called Birmingham High School in San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles. And so suddenly, so year 7 through year 12, and I was probably 12 years old when I started going to junior high school with people who were in the same exact school, having lunch at the same time and things, but people who intentionally were failing high school because they liked doing auto shop and metal shop and things like that. So here's these people that are, guys that are like, 20 that, they've got beards and mustaches. And so here I am 12 and here's these guys that are 20. But socially and culturally, one side of the school, which just incidentally, quite amazingly, the whole high school during the, World War II was a hospital. So all of the buildings were converted into classrooms from what had been a hospital during the war. Um, so on one side, in the say Van Nuys side, there were um, predominantly people from Mexico, many from broken families, very poor. The fathers worked in the local Chevrolet plant, and so these people were there, and of course, not all of them, but many of them were the ones that wanted to do the metal shop and the auto shop kind of thing, or wanted to stay in school for a long time, or um, so suddenly then my eyes were opened to, even though it was like only a mile or two away from where I grew up, but I was out of this whole bubble. And like I said, I knew this like Republican kind of middle class, you know, um, tract housing, good houses. But anyway, so all of a sudden my eyes opened to that, and that was quite different because they used to also sometimes have like small gang fights after school outside the opposite gate of the side that I lived on. And, they had made zip guns that fired real bullets and metal shop and things. And so here's this whole other world that completely opened to me. And then when you put this other thing in the mix, which is unbelievable, which the third part of the triangle was Encino, California. And that's roughly, you might say, the Mulholland Drive kind of movie people area. So suddenly, like when you hit year 9, halfway, like junior high to high school, so the junior high had finished in Encino, and where they came to was Birmingham. So all of a sudden, these very wealthy young people, who many of them came from movie industry families and were given, like, for their 16th birthday, the first day they can drive a car or something, they're given like a brand new Corvette or something. So here's this combination in this school, very, very big school. I think in my graduating class, I think there were 600 people in my graduating class, I think from memory. Um, so it was a very, very big school. But here's this melting pot of like how I grew up and thinking that this is what the world was in that cultural bubble, which would have been, I guess, roughly a maybe 2 mile kind of area. But being young, that's what life was. That's all I knew. And so suddenly I'm in this triangle of this middle class, upper class, lower class combination of that
Mhm.
coming together and in a very big school. And yeah, so
And what does
uh,
that help you understand about power and privilege when you see those levels and when they come into your awareness? And how do you
well,
see power and privilege in your life in general?
well, I mean, I think that being my, say, first eye-opening experience, and the enormous gaps between people, um, and a good reality shake up in a way, like quite frightening. I mean, to be, 13 years old and walking home from school and having a gang fight going on the corner and things like that. So quite frightening kind of awareness. But I think it's quite it's I think at a time, especially with COVID, when I feel, say, vulnerable to, say, watching the news and wanting to know what's going on in the world, but also, given as an example, Afghanistan, but being so horrified. And probably the thing that interests me most psychologically at the moment is the phenomenon of overwhelm. And so there's um, just just kind of using that example of, say, the Mexican Chevy worker, broken families or something. There was like the beginning of an interest in, oh, how other people live, and it's not the same. But that's continued for me in always more important for me than money has been being able to help people that need help, that need support. So I think that going back to the thing about the news, I'm very, very, very interested, probably more than ever, in helping people who are the least advantaged. And for simplicity's sake, I would say um, um, I'm being offered quite a bit of money to do some work that is very related to what I like doing, but probably much more interesting for me is, say, co-counseling, um, and bringing communities of people together to be able to talk emotionally and share and be available to each other in times of need and crisis and trauma, and just building relationships on a different level as well too. So yeah, it's a combination for me of being traumatized by, you know, the enormous gaps in wealth and how people are treated, and feeling overwhelmed by that, but also somewhere wanting to have my ground or my focus to be able to support people who do need that. Just anecdotally, I'll say, and I cried about this yesterday when I told another therapist about it. But there was a woman in East Timor, and um, when the Indonesian slash Javanese were trying to stop East Timor from seceding, when they went there to fight the war, they stole East Timor children. And so I saw this program where there was a woman, I don't know where she was from. She may not have even been from East Timor. She wasn't a Western woman. But what she was doing was finding these children who had been kidnapped and taken to Java, who were now grown up and 50, 60 years old or something, and bringing them back to Timor with at their choice, of course, bringing them back to East Timor and reuniting them with the families that remained and having a group, not even, quote, running a group, but having a group of people that were sharing what their experiences were and what had happened and all of the emotion that was there with that. And she was just there kind of holding that group. She wasn't, quote, leading it or going deeper or anything like that. So I think those things are of great interest for me in terms of enormous cultural gaps and yeah, yeah.
So another aspect of yourself that I'm curious about, and it also has to do sort of with all of these different strata and social positions, is gender. How would you say that you live and experience yourself within your gender, or as a man, or in masculinity, or if there's anything about that that you would like to touch on?
Um, well, probably starting with the same thing about like how I grew up and say how my mother was treated by my father, which was phenomenally well, I would say. Um, um, there are probably other aspects of that in terms of maybe his passive aggression or something like that, but um, I they somehow got along incredibly well, and think the weak point for me was probably in a healthy way whatever they figured out or worked out, or it was behind closed doors. So I never knew the mechanics. I felt quite naive because when felt like I first fell in love, um, it felt like marriage was almost like this third entity that looked after you because I knew so little about, say, intimate male female relationships. And um, my first girlfriend in seventh grade, I kind of idolized her, and then um, she, and not even any, I mean, she was kind of a goddess to me in a sense, and we spent enormous time together. But then I found out that she got drunk with this older guy and had sex with him. My whole world fell apart. But um, growing up, say, with my dad and my mom and how well they got along together, and even, I'd say, even kind of financially, I'd say the weakness with my parents was never showing me how or what made things work. So I was, again, I hate to keep referring back to Ozzy and Harriet, Leave It to Beaver, but there was
Mm.
somehow, well, it works because it works, and didn't really
And
know
so
what.
how did you figure that out just like later? What what did you develop into, or how did you resource yourself on that?
So talking more mainly man woman wise, staying with that for the moment, yeah. I mean,
Yeah, I
well,
mean, I'm sort of curious of how you've come to understand yourself from that starting point.
I mean, so okay. Other than the things we've already talked about, so where were you kind of looking to go with that? I'm not quite sure.
No, I'm just to continue with the question sort of about gender and masculinity. I mean,
Okay,
if
okay.
you didn't get taught, how did you figure it out, or how have you come to understand it?
Well, I think from being naive, and I made such enormous mistakes. Like I would have never imagined, like in year seven, with that kind of idealization um, of of, um, of women, and I'm sure 100% that both my dad and mom were monogamous and committed in that way. And so I sort of thought, naively, well, when I get married, quote unquote, the God of marriage is the glue that holds things together, because I was so naive. And I
Magical
was,
thinking.
yeah, magical and naive. But just going back slightly, my my dad grew up in Minnesota with my parents, and my mother did too. Um, I mean, with his parents, sorry. And then my grandfather had an affair, and so my dad, as a teenager, moved to California with my grandmother. And so, as a teenager, he was responsible for, and I don't know. I mean, this is one of the things that I, you know, feel sad that I never got to have conversations with my dad about some of these things in depth or detail. But whatever the dynamics would have been of it being about my grandmother having to deal emotionally with being left, or I don't know who left who, but the affair, and then her being with my dad as a teenager, and that forming his somehow his view or connection with women. And then that would have carried over into how he was with my mother. And so when I say, I didn't know the mechanics and being naive, I would guess, and it's just, pretty strong guess, but I'd say in terms of, say, passive aggressiveness with my mother, my dad would have probably been angry as a teenager, but not even known that in Beverly Hills that he was angry with his mother because he had no choice. And so they would have bonded because that's what they had, but he wouldn't have had the support of a father to know that there was something other than that. So um, I wouldn't say that there was ever anything palpable of, oh, my dad was so angry with his mother, because of that type of bonding in that particular age. But I would say that my dad took the positivity of that bonding into the relationship with my mother. And so whatever that anger might have been, that he wouldn't even probably have known about in himself, relative to growing up with his mother as a teenager. He wouldn't have even really known about that. But probably typical 50s stuff. But he'd come home from a hard day's work, and my mom, if I wasn't behaving, would say, "You wait until I tell your father." I'd be terrified all day. My father would come home, and I'd be the source of his download. He wouldn't say, "Wait a minute, before I even talk to him, what happened with you today with him?" You know. So I was just the kind of venting from my father toward what my mother said was, the um, the undisputed truth, reality.
Mm, yeah.
So, so I
Yeah.
would say, and then just a side thing within that. I remember my mother mentioning later in my life. She said, "Who would you be if I hadn't played devil's advocate with you?" And I never felt like my mother was trying to stop me from doing things, but I always felt like I kind of had to go to battle to justify passions and things that I wanted to do. And I remember feeling quite shocked and almost like it was almost like a kind of psychopathic thing. I mean it in more kind of garden variety of psychopath, but that she was kind of messing with me in a sense to quote make me stronger, but at the same time never stopping me from any of my dreams. And if there's one thing that I would give my parents credit to, however they did it, even if it was devil's advocate, somehow whatever my dreams were, I was allowed to realize those dreams. I was not stopped from that. Just a quick anecdote. At probably 10 years old, my grandfather found a dove. My grandfather and grandmother got back together, but my grandfather found a dove, and the dove had a broken wing. And so myself and my sister had a playhouse. My sister also formed some of course, 6 years older, my view of women, so to speak. We'll come back to that. But so neither of us used this big playhouse. So I nursed the dove back to where it could fly. And then I started raising doves at 10 years old. And then I started renting them out to magicians and people who were having weddings. And that's an example of, well, that was my dream. And my parents, they just basically like, go for it, you know?
Yeah, it's
And I
a
never felt like they were
remarkable
parallel, like,
entrepreneuring spirit there. That's a remarkable little entrepreneur kind of enterprise.
yeah, well, I was always allowed and supported in some unusual way to, quote, pursue my dreams and then to see, you know, how I could support myself in that, you know? And I got an allowance, but by choice, I mowed lawns because I wanted to support myself, or, you know, so, yeah, they weren't, I guess, in terms of, say, middle class kind of luxury, there was never any pressure on me to have to make money, but there was a kind of healthy thing of like, oh, I'm going to pursue my passion and I'll see what can also come out of it. So, yeah, but then just diverging to my sister again, I think, um, and I haven't spoken to my sister for 20 years since my father died, and she's in California. But I think because she grew up at another time, so I was, quote, more 60s, she was more 50s. She was the first child. Um, my dad had just come back from World War II, and I'm sure that my sister, thinking that life was all about her and my mom, her mom, thinking that it was all about that. Suddenly, this man comes in, and however adoring of her, of my sister, I don't know, wasn't there, but I'm sure that the interference in the bonding of 4 or 5 years with my mother, suddenly a man is part of it. Um, and then the second man slash baby boy comes along. So, so I think so. My sister, even though she kind of adored me as this cute little object or something, but I think I grew up with a sister, and I was treated better as a second child because they knew more, for one thing, and um, relative to as a teenager, my sister's vulnerability with boys, or even being stalked by an older man one time when she was a teenager, horrendously, with the police involved. And so they were always much more kind of protective, sort of watchful of her, where they were very, very, very free with me. Um, so I felt like, I mean, this is just kind of going back to the core of my mother being a, you wait till your father comes home, and my sister going, yeah, he's cute, but he's taken over my life. And so I kind of feel like I was, had this kind of that kind of, I'd say my, you know, subconsciously, I'd say that's where I have some anger toward women from those situations of what I grew up in with that. So I think I have the kind of adoration on one end of the naive end of it. And then I have this bewilderment on the other end of like, how can women/girls treat me like that when I don't know what they're on about? So I think when I got married for the first time on 2 doses of LSD and Catalina, I had that, I think, adoration of of my partner who I had the first child with. But I think that as I came to know her as an individual/more time together and things, it I the gap between how I saw my mother and father just naturally getting along, and me just feeling like, basically wanting to control her. Why can't you be, the way that I need you to be so that I can get along? And yeah. So
I'm guessing that didn't work out so much.
oh no, it was terrible. It was terrible. And then again, there was the overlapping of the sort of drug experimentation and taking it out of the realm of the LSD and barbiturates or diet pills and things like that. So nervous system wise for both of us too, it was very, 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 very volatile and yeah. So, but and
So
at that
that's
point,
mhm.
but
No, go
but
ahead.
so at that point, she had been in college. She had been with several guys, and so I think when she gravitated toward me, she thought that she knew who I was based on that experience, where she was really the first woman that I was with, and then kind of imagining that the marriage umbrella and the relation that my parents had or something. It just works because it works. So I was quite, again, like because I would be, say, the sitter for people who were taking acid and be taking it. So in one way, I was quite, quite, quite mature and supportive and knowing how to be with people. But when it came to just being one on one with a woman, was just, you know, severely lacking in experience and knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Because my first experience was this very traumatic one that I mentioned when
Mm-hmm.
I was in year 7 and the girl got drunk. And,
Yeah.
yeah. So,
So, I mean, this is definitely a sense of sort of where you've come from and the things that you grew up through. But I'm curious to jump quite a bit ahead to where you are right now and how you're experiencing your current age and that aging process along the way.
let me just rewind because I just had a kind of snapshot of something really important. So, because I'm over 2 meters tall, I'm 6'8", and so through high school, and there were girls that were interested in me and things, but I felt very, very, very shy, probably because of my height, because as in everything in high school and junior high, whatever it is that makes you different, where the arrow goes.
Yes,
So
being extraordinary, being the tall poppy is not always.
definitely, definitely. So yeah, so that whole time I was also quite shy toward girls. And my grandfather, this is hilarious, but also painful in a way, but he had many a few apartment buildings, and people would move out and they would leave their magazines and newspapers and things behind. And his garage was completely full, but he would collect like Playboys or any other men's magazines, and he would have them in his garage. And I discovered that he had this stash of these magazines. So this shy guy used to go into my grandfather's garage and look at real women. This is what women are. So I felt like also in the mix was this kind of physical idealization of what women are supposed to look like, or the
Yeah.
perfect woman.
Maybe a bit of a skewed sample, but yeah.
So that also entered. I mean, when I got married, my first wife she was very, very attractive. So I mean, she was kind of the quote unquote Playboy bunny, so to speak. So there was that, well, you know, I know how relationships work. My parents always got along, and she's like a Playboy bunny. So this is going to be perfect. Anyway, a lifelong process of unwinding and all of that.
Mm. Yeah, I can imagine. So, so where are you on that process, on that whole aging experience, and how are you experiencing yourself now in this phase of adulthood that you're in?
As far as relationship right now, or
No, in terms of aging itself, in terms of your experience of age and aging.
well, I not everybody loves my humor, but I love my humor, and many people love my humor, and I feel in a way, and there's a lot of humor in therapy too that I think mainly clients appreciate enormously, and brings a almost like a, for lack of a better word, a kind of hypnotic throwing a spanner into something that's just headed in a dark direction or something. Not to I mean, simply put, to say, put another perspective on it, not to undermine it or change the subject or anything, and then it can get back on track in whatever way it gets back on track. But I would say I've had a very wonderful life in terms of pleasure and um, even day-to-day humor with people in shops and things like that. So I feel very abundant in terms of, like I said, I mean, there's for me, there's the kind of horror of how neurotic the world is in a sense. But as I kind of swim through that world, I swim through it with a lot of humor that is quite natural and free and fun and spontaneous for me. So I would say that's a big component in me enjoying life. And then I've had the passion, as per like what I said about Linda Sussman from very early on in my life, being able to pursue that, or what I said about somehow with my parents, go where you want to go with things. And so I feel like I've had a very, very, very kind of spirit abundant life and very rich life. And it hasn't been without pain in terms of intimate relationships, or you know fear as far as children growing up, and it hasn't been without pain in any sense. But I would say, in terms of my spirit and my drive and my passion, and being very true to a changing shape. So like, using it as a metaphor, I could get on a plane to East Timor tomorrow. Have nothing to do with money. I don't have much money. Different story relative to property, but anyway. Um, so I would say, and then because of the travel, I would say in a way the world is my oyster. So, so in terms of travel and in terms of doing the things that give me joy in life with my work, and the deep relationships that I do have with people that I can have deep communication with, the clients that want to know about themselves, um, and yeah, creative ideas about things I want to do therapeutically and things. So I would never, and I haven't had any kind of overt physical problems at all. Um, I had a benign thing that surprised me out of the blue, and you know, things that I kind of learned more under the surface that were going on with my body that I didn't know about. But overall, I'd say I'm aging very, very, very well, and I still feel, in a lot of ways, I still feel like a teenager. I still feel, I still feel very young at heart and very young in my spirit. And
Mm.
I just turned 73 about a month ago, and my father, 6 months after my mother died, and him grieving enormously, he had never been to Asia, but I, with my family, invited him to Bali, where I owned a house, invited him to Bali. And to make a long story short, he said, I've never felt better and more relaxed in my whole life. And he had a stroke while he was there, and he fell off a cliff, and I stopped him from falling to the river.
Wow.
And just a very quick anecdote in that, but as he was falling and me not knowing what had happened, he was just looking at the view. But I had like within a split second, I had three things. One was he was mean to me. I should just let him go to the river and pay the price. Number two is, they weren't necessarily in this order, but number two is he's in such bad condition from bouncing down the cliff. He might be in worse situation if he lives. Maybe I should let him go so he doesn't have to live a life of being a vegetable. And then number three, I mean, instantaneously, and he weighed more than me, but he's my father. And I grabbed him by the belt and pulled him up onto the path as he was starting to head down toward the river. So I'm moving a little bit fast, but he was 73, and I have just turned 73. So, so it's a little bit more under the magnifying glass. I'm saying I feel good. I've got these passions, I'm still a teenager, so to speak, or
Yeah.
something like that.
Nobody's quite ready for those things that happen to older people to start happening to people your own age.
Absolutely. But something like, being the same age as my dad when that happened, it's like, the alarm bell, and I'm going, shut that bell off. I don't need that. I'm doing fine. So yeah, it's a kind of, and then also like say, roughly 2 years of not traveling. I mean, the COVID thing, when part of me feeling youthful and mobile and everything was movement in the world. And now it's like, this is what people do when they're retired. They don't go anywhere, they just stay at home. So that kind of combination of like, well, when I travel, am I going to be one of these people that's like going around the country on a bus, getting off with a cane, and getting back on in a half hour? Yeah, it's a strange time in that way.
It is. It is indeed. So I do want to shift a little bit, and I want to ask where Gestalt came into your life. Where did you two meet?
So Gestalt came into my life as part of the Center for the Healing Arts project. And I wish, and they were all well known, probably some of them continue to be well known, even though most of them probably not still alive, because at that point they would have been in their 50s, probably most of them. Um, and I wish I could say their names because they would be recognizable names. The two names that really pop up for me are Jack Rosenberg and then his overlap of Gestalt and the body. And um, yeah, who I just said a minute ago. But yeah, they're the people that come to mind. They wouldn't have necessarily been the people that I was the most involved with, but as part of the program, those people would all come into the program and do some work with them. And that program was, well, put it this way, I mean, one way or another, I would have been involved with these Gestalt therapists who were involved there for a couple of years, and part of that with, say, Naomi's training, but and having guest trainers who were already part of the Center for the Healing Arts coming in and doing specific work. So, yeah, that was my first introduction, but very parallel the work with the body and very wanting to pursue that relative to my work with the body. And then just jumping ahead a little bit, as soon as I came to Australia in 1983, I guess, something like that. But there was a really wonderful psychiatrist, Barry Blakarsky, who ran the one and only Gestalt training in Australia. And he was in Brisbane, and he asked me to come and work for him. So I did training for Barry Blakarsky, and then later Barry moved to Sydney and had a place called the Center for Experiential Learning, and I did work there as well. And then started to be more and more parallel, more and more of my own work. So I would go down there and work at his place, but be doing my work. But at that same time, the person who took over the Brisbane Gestalt, and again, I think it was the one and only train. Well, no, there was Barry's in Sydney, and then there was Yarrow Sterak's in Brisbane. So then I worked for Yarrow Sterak in that. And then there was a third Gestalt training group in Sydney that when I'd be down there with Barry or doing my work or something, I would do some weekends for them. And then locally, what was the Lismore, the North Coast Gestalt, Steve Vina Gunther, then I did a lot of guest work there. Yeah.
And when you say your work, what would you say is some of the essence of what you do with and within and around Gestalt?
Well, it's almost not palpable for me because things have become over the years kind of such a blend for me. But I'll tell you an anecdote about one of the groups that I ran for Steve Vina Gunther that will illuminate some of the question that you're asking me. So the group had been together for 2 years, and I came in and they all were introducing themselves as part of the group, who they were. And there was all this kind of praise for me of, oh, we've heard so much about you and we're looking forward to working with you. And it was all these different kind of forms of praise from 15 people or something that I had never met, didn't know, whatever. And then I did a brief introduction of myself. And then I said, okay, well, let's start the group now. And so they said, okay. And so I'm going to move a little bit out of the way in a second, but I asked the group, I said, okay, I want you to all turn around and look at that painting on the wall behind you. And so they all turned around and looked at the painting for about 5 minutes in total silence. And I think probably inside they were probably going, he's going to ask what color we saw, or, oh, I saw a dragon, and oh, you saw a dragon, let's talk about that. Or so they all probably had different versions of what I might expect when we came back to the group. So then for 2 minutes, probably, I was absolutely silent. And they sat there in kind of discomfort in the silence. And then my statement to them was, what did you do that for? Meaning, why did you turn around and look at the painting? And they said, because you told us to. And I said, listen, you don't know me from a bar of soap. You have no reason to trust me whatsoever. I said, we are all here in one way or another because of what has happened to us, because of authority, of being on the other end of authority who didn't really see us and just acted out what they had to act out upon us. And so I said, you come in here with this openness, meaning in terms of projecting um, onto me as the good authority. You don't know what kind of authority I am. I might be, good, bad, medium, ugly, terrible, wonderful for each of you if you are paying attention to yourselves. Um, so I said that trust has to be earned, and that would be the most therapeutic thing that can happen here. And as part of that, um, I want you, just like with the painting, I want you, like I might say, um, okay, I want you, if I'm your therapist, I want you to say this now. I want you, ideally, you would say to me, Chris, before I even think about saying what you asked me to say, who's the guy that's asking me to say that? And then I'll think about whether I want to say that or do that or not. And so there's a relationship that forms. And I think the nature of say being the therapist and being in quote power, not even consciously, so to speak, but it's very easy to get people or ask people to do things, or and especially if there's some degree of desperation, I'll try anything, or he must know what he's talking about, or something like that. But for me, it's about the establishment of the relationship and the transference and the countertransference, and watching myself, because the therapy, the only half the reason I'm doing therapy is my own development, is to be able to see who is the guy that asked that question, um, and to be able to, and I think partly not even necessarily consciously, kind of subconsciously, but um, is to be liked. I want everyone to like me. So, so when you're the good authority, then you're liked. So I'm interested in that whole thing of like, the transference and the counter transference and the projections and making that alive and and changing and creating a dynamic kind of relationship that most people aren't familiar with, or like I said about me growing up, ways that I'm still healing myself about learning more about relationship. And everybody teaches me something more and different about relationship because they're in a different form and different history and race, or you name it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And what would you say some of the most significant challenges that you've run into working, teaching, dealing with Gestalt? What have the challenges been for you?
Um, well, this is probably just a starting point. because it's something I've been thinking about lately because there's so much kind of emergency stuff going on COVID wise. But say, for example, if you were the client and you came in and you needed to download, um, and you needed to really get things off your chest. And so I'm anointed or appointed as the listener. And it is important to have a listening quality, of course, as a major part of the therapy. But in terms of like, say, when I start to disappear, meaning I'm overwhelmed or I've heard enough or I'm having some reactions or um, so it's how to I think find that balance between being able to let people get it off their chest and then also having to at some point for the mutual benefit theirs and mine go yoo-hoo I've got to stop now or do you want to know what I'm doing with what you've said so far?
Mm.
Otherwise it's pearls before swine. It wasn't a pun, pearls, but yeah. So, I mean, I find that challenging, especially at times when there is more crisis. And um, I'm, especially from California, much more used to people who are, I want long term, ongoing psychotherapy because I see the value of that. Whereas coming to Australia, I was the very first therapist in private practice in this region. And people who worked for the government that were psychologists said, you will never get a private practice together. There's too much stigma. People don't have money. I said, look, you watch. If people have to pay me with bananas at the back door at midnight, I am going to get together a practice here. And now in Byron Bay, it's almost impossible to find somebody who isn't a therapist of one sort or another. There's even sort of major comedy on YouTube and so forth. Um, J.P. Sears, he's done something, Byron Bay, the spiritual capital of the universe. And, um,
I had no idea. Is this like the Esalen of Australia, kind of?
uh, well, it's become very, I mean, this is what's hard for me because I kind of did the New Age the first time around. And now it's almost more New Age than it was the first time around. It's just, you know, I mean, an example being like you can't you can't go to Bali these days. I mean, when it was open, without breath workshops here, there, and everywhere. So it's like that here, and very much in Byron Bay too, with not just breath, but many different you know thousands of modalities and so forth for a small place or a relatively small place. It's a lot going on.
Mhm. And that kind of makes me wonder. I usually ask sort of what's coming up next for you, and what you might think would be next for Gestalt, but I also kind of wonder, what do you think we'll come back to? I mean, if we've already sort of been there and done a lot of these things, what are we coming back to, or where are we going with Gestalt from your perspective?
Well, with Gestalt in particular, or with my work, or
It's sort of a two-pronged. I mean, you personally, where are you going? Personally, professionally, like what are your directions that are still left to explore? And where do you think, or where do you see Gestalt going in more general terms?
well, well, I a little bit pre-pandemic, but I was in Japan, and relative to co-counseling and relative to Japanese and the things that they keep inside them and why they keep those things inside them and so forth. And overall, I love Japan and I love being around Japanese people, and I have many Japanese friends there. But I have an enormous fascination with um, the combination of how genuinely respectful they are in human ways that a lot of us aren't in the West, and how repressed they are within that. It's two things that are true and related. So I actually did a small experiential um, co-counseling group that I really, really, really loved doing. Um, and just anecdotally, and I mean, this was almost a Gestalt kind of thing slash role play, but I was I was talking about what we were going to do and how we were going to do it and why with an interpreter and so forth. And then I thought, well, no, I've got some issues going on for me right now. Um, that if I were in therapy or doing some counseling, then I would. This is what I would need to bring up. So I just said, oh, no, I'll be both the client and therapist in the process. So they really loved it. They watched me go from one chair to the other of me expressing what was going on for me, and then me being, quote, the co-counseling listener, questioner, whatever kind of thing. So that got interrupted, but I really loved. Um, well, I'd like to pursue that in Japan when I go back there. If I'm not a guy on the bus with a cane that's only in a place for half an hour, but fingers crossed. But I'd like to pursue that. And then when I was in Bali and right before COVID, but um, and very, very, very few people know or are involved with or use this, but um, some of the work that Wilhelm Reich and Alexander Lowen did relative to the eyes, and the eyes being the first developmental stage, um, and us coming into the world and that being the only thing that we have control of, like looking for our source of food and um, and that continued bonding and so forth. So that has it is the predominant thing really in how we see the world, is how we have developed eye brain. And so incredible work was done and has been long forgotten and lost, um, with the pen light and lying down and tracking a pen light and going out of the realm of what your normal field of vision would be, where unconsciously we feel safe and we feel controlled because I know what this is and I know who that is. And so, I mean, we unconsciously we're, quote, looking for that or identifying with that, or not that there isn't a shock or horror or something that comes out of the blue. It's not to say that. But I have some very, very specific um, negativity toward EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, because what preceded that was for me so much more involved. And yeah, um, and I feel quite sad that there wasn't, that got developed without even some acknowledgement. It was almost as if that was just found and existed in a bubble, when preceding that is this wonderful work. So when I was in Bali, I was doing some work with somebody who was very, very quite public. And by the way, I've spoken like international conference in Bali before, and um, But this last time, right before COVID, I was working with somebody who's quite exposed to the public, who had a major blinking problem, was continually blinking only in social situations. And so I got to know him well enough. So I asked him if I could see if I could help him with that. So there's these underlying things, a la the work of Reich and Lowen, for example, and say that I work. There are these things that I'm still chomping at the bit. That, and these things are kind of they're kind of dying off, because when people maybe do, figure out a marketable product, they don't necessarily go back and say, oh, look, this was done before, done in that way, or something like that. They just try and reinvent it, and they're
It's
beneficial.
reinventing the wheel and then selling the new
Yeah,
wheel. Mhm.
yeah, yeah. And even just taking the simplest spokes of the wheel without going, no, this is a big wheel from back then. I'll keep it simple. So, so I really, I love doing that. I love like exposing people, like say the Japanese, or the work that I did with him, which had a big effect. Um, I I love doing that. It's kind of like exploring, experimenting. It's cross-cultural. I, I I love I love doing that, and look forward to doing more of that. And I am doing some kind of formal online work with China right now, and I do. I'm just exploring a little bit more the possibility of going back to kind of experiments, because there is, in a way, culturally, it's too hard to rewind. There, in terms of authority, they are frequently looking for the person to tell them what to do. And the things that I talked about before in the Gestalt group and the painting, that's not something you do at this point in time. It's culturally, it's a whole other zone. But I'm kind of interested in the Gestalt part of, like, especially on screen slash online, like, oh, could you maybe try saying this a few times, or could you? And actually, I'm using, a lot more. Not like I've never been a person that says, "Could you articulate that gesture more?" or something. I've never been a person who does that, because I know people will do that just because you've told them to. And just a kind of quick footnote, but say in terms of bioenergetics and say Alexander Lowen's rigidity. So it's like, now we're all going to do a total anger release, and we're going to pound the pillow, and we're going to use our shoulders. And so in terms of optimal movement, there's nothing wrong with that. But one of the things that interests me most is resistance analysis. So we have these resistances in our body and socially and things for a reason historically, and that's to be respected. So I became well known that where I took the bioenergetics was, one person might be like expressing their anger because they're ready to. They might be doing exactly that optimal thing. The other person might be going, you know, this is the most profound anger thing that I've ever done, but I'm so angry with you. I don't want anyone to know how angry I am. And it would be, the whisper would be, in terms of the resistance and the respect of the resistance, would be the most profound thing. And then what comes next comes next. So jumping a little bit ahead, but when I left Bali, I'm most interested in pool, quote, bioenergetics, self-regulation. So they may be looking at me outside the pool for a demonstration, and I go, you're the authority. And I would have on the side of the pool all kinds of props, meaning masks. I'll just, I'll take the screen and I'll show you one thing very quickly. So I have, for probably 40 years, more, I've collected masks.
Wow.
This isn't a mask, I'm back. Yeah, in terms of, say, even the online thing that I've been doing with China, but just quite spontaneously, I just sit back down 1 second. So spontaneously, she was talking about a person that she was quite upset, and I go, oh, there's a mask, and I grabbed the mask, and then I was that person instead of me on the screen turning sideways or something. I was that person. So I did that a couple of times, and I have done, just never been taught, but spontaneously done some mask groups where people took on the identity of something that they felt like was the shadow, or something that they needed to connect with in themselves. And
That
so
sounds sort of really fascinating to explore, and that is a very impressive collection, I must say.
it's so amazing because you both, you're hiding, you get to hide so you feel safe, but you're also, quote, living up to that thing that you know that you are. So it's a really interesting double-edged kind of thing, in a positive way. So yeah, sort of Gestalt wise, I like that. I mean, talking to, so what I talked about, the pool, spontaneous self-regulation, quote unquote bioenergetics, but there could be just spontaneously, if there's latex masks on the side of the pool or something, then you know you've gone from like whacking the water with a pool noodle to going, I feel like a lion. You grab a lion, and maybe nobody else feels like doing that, but you do it by yourself, or maybe someone feels like being a rhinoceros. So I'm just that kind of self-regulation and exploration, and a lot of that comes through my own time in the pool in Bali and daily massages for $15 at the end of the day. So my fantasy is I would love to be doing the pool work, um, self-regulation with many choosable props, and I would also like to be doing the eye work. And I can have a kind of processing part of the group where we meet internally and talk and so forth. Um, and yeah, the, the masks being part of that too. Yeah. But I'm glad that like Gestalt has become more relational. I think it can continue to become more relational. Um, but say what was the Fritz Perls demo? The name, she worked with Carl Rogers and Fritz Perls, and I forget the woman's name. It was a demonstration thing of him doing
Gloria?
Gestalt.
Yeah, Gloria.
Yeah, Gloria. But I mean, that was the early days. But the thing that I really loved about that was like she was almost demanding that he be relational, and he was so offended and so angry, and because he wouldn't, quote, behave in an appropriate Gestalt therapeutic way. And I think she was like way ahead of her time. But then
Yeah, it's she was looking for the person, right? And now you're saying, you interrupt the session to be like, hey, I'm the person, I'm here.
yeah,
Mhm.
yeah.
Yeah.
But then I thought, I mean, this is my assessment, but and maybe appropriate for those times. But I thought, in terms of his own passive aggression, because she didn't behave, she was demanding relationship. Then his assessment of her therapeutically, he, he ravaged her.
Yeah, I think we can have the Gloria conversations another day, but I
But
am curious
I'm
if
glad it's become more relational as well. I just did a
yes,
total rewind and it's becoming more
yes.
and more relational. It had to
Yeah,
start
there's
somewhere.
there's definitely a curve there for sure. So I am curious sort of to come to a wind up of our conversation for now, for today. Is there anything about you that you feel I've left out that is important to you, or that you'd like to speak to about how Gestalt has been important or has impacted you?
Um, um, I think because of, say, the most recent training work that I'd done with the Gestalt work was here on the North Coast with Steve Vinay Gunther's Institute. And it was largely to introduce that more relational part of it to the work. So I think that um, even though this work that I'm being asked to do in China, it's for Gestalt purposes. So it almost feels to me like for some people who are observing, who are, say, current Gestalt therapists, for example, then they're connecting the dots of how this is Gestalt per se, or they hire me to come in and do what I do because they see that connection. Um, and I'm doing a little bit of work relative to the Brisbane Gestalt as well. So but I think that because of what I described of that whole rainbow of my learning and when I learned Gestalt and that whole spectrum of that intermingling and integrating with the things that I have done in the body work and so forth. So it's almost, it's not very palpable and I feel a little bit, yeah, I feel a bit disappointed in myself that I can't articulate it better and say, here's how what I do relates to Gestalt, and if this, then that, and then this. It's almost it's there and ever present, but it's not really tangible for me. But it is tangible to the people who are quote studying it, and yeah, I feel. Um, Yeah, I feel like it's a particular weakness that I can't articulate that any better than what I
No, I
said.
mean, I don't expect people to speak in like a referenced essay format or anything like that. I really do appreciate. I feel like I've just gone for a nice long walk in the country with you, but we got somewhere. Um, so is it all right for you if we end this here? It's been very
It,
interesting to get to know you, and I don't think I mean, everyone has obviously got their own take, but I'm feeling like I've just had a very sort of unique encounter with you, and I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much, and I felt like you've been just very engaged and asked some good questions and some nice surprises in the mix of it, and um, yeah, I've really you made me just feels so natural and unfolding and letting you know who I am and where I've been and where I want to go. It's been a real pleasure doing that with you. Very much appreciate you and how you're doing what you're doing and being fortunate to have this time with you.
Thank you. Okay, so shall we leave this here?
Pardon?
Shall we leave this here then?
Yeah, we'll leave it here.